I still remember that day vividly. It wasn't supposed to be anything significant, just another routine trip to the doctor's office. Sophia had been mentioning this checkup for weeks, and I had offered to come along, more out of habit than necessity. You know, the dutiful husband, waiting patiently in the car or in the sterile, overly lit waiting room while she handled her health concerns. She was always so punctual. Sophia, organized to a fault. When she called out, "Mark, are you ready?" That morning, I'd barely looked up from my laptop. "Yeah, just give me a second," I had mumbled, shutting my work emails with a sigh. I didn't think much of it when we arrived at the clinic. I sat in the waiting room scrolling through my phone, half listening to the faint hum of soft rock playing through the overhead speakers. I didn't even glance up when her name was called. "Mrs. Walker," the nurse announced. "Right here." Sophia's voice was bright, cheerful. I caught the faintest glimpse of her disappearing into the hallway with the doctor. Dr. Blake, I think his name was. A tall man, good-looking, with that polished air of confidence doctors always seem to have. I remember thinking, why do they all look like they've walked out of a medical drama on TV? I don't know why I noticed that, but I did. I must have been scrolling on my phone for 20 minutes, maybe 30. It wasn't until I glanced up at the frosted glass door leading into the office that I realized how long it had been. Longer than usual, but maybe they were running behind. It's a doctor's office. There's always a backlog. The faint hum of voices from the hallway reached me every now and then, muffled and indistinct. I even caught her laugh at one point, soft and unfamiliar, followed by the deeper timbre of his voice. Strange, I thought. Sophia doesn't usually laugh like that. Not in public, anyway. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was more restrained, almost nervous. But something about it prickled at the back of my neck. When the door finally opened, Sophia stepped out, her cheeks faintly flushed, her eyes bright in a way I couldn't quite explain. Dr. Blake stood in the doorway behind her, his smile polite but lingering for just a second too long. "Everything all set?" I asked, standing up. Sophia nodded quickly, brushing past me toward the door. "Yep, all good, let's go." But as I followed her, something caught my eye. Her lips, slightly swollen, fuller than when we'd arrived. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the subtle sheen on them, like they'd been kissed or bitten, was unmistakable. It was a small detail, but it didn't fit the sterile, detached world of a doctor's office. "Are you okay?" I asked, feigning nonchalance while my chest tightened with unease. She hesitated, her hand brushing across her mouth as if to wipe away whatever had caught my attention. "Yes, of course. Why wouldn't I be?" Her tone was light, but there was something off, an edge of defensiveness that didn't match her usual composure. I didn't press further, but as we walked to the car, I couldn't stop glancing at her, the question gnawing at the back of my mind. What the hell happened in there? Dr. Blake didn't say much, just a simple, "Take care, Mrs. Walker," as he disappeared back into the office. But it stayed with me. The way she avoided my gaze, the faint tension in her shoulders, the unspoken something that hung in the air between us as we left the clinic. It wasn't enough to raise any alarms. Not yet. But something about that day stuck with me, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. Over the next few weeks, the moment in the doctor's office refused to leave my mind. It was ridiculous, really. Sophia was my wife. Loyal, loving, steady. I told myself I was overthinking, letting my imagination twist something innocent into something sordid. But then the changes started. Small things at first. Sophia began spending more time on her appearance. She started wearing lipstick again, a shade of red she hadn't touched in years. Her phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter or bedside table, now seemed glued to her hand. She'd laugh at texts, quickly tucking the screen away when I walked by. "You're glowing lately," I said one morning over breakfast, trying to mask my unease with a playful smile. "What's your secret?" She glanced up, her cheeks coloring faintly. "Just trying to take better care of myself," she said lightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You don't mind, do you?" "Of course not," I replied, though the words felt hollow. It wasn't that I minded, it was that I didn't understand. One evening, I came home from work to find her dressed in a fitted blouse and tailored pants, her hair swept back into an elegant twist. She wasn't going anywhere, she claimed, just experimenting with her wardrobe. It didn't make sense. This wasn't the Sophia I knew, the woman who lounged in yoga pants and oversized sweaters after a long day. And then there were the errands, short trips out of the house that became more frequent, more secretive. One Friday evening, Sophia announced she had to run an errand. Again, it was the third time that week. I watched her slip into her heels and that crimson lipstick, the same one she'd worn the day of her doctor's visit. She looked stunning, but it gnawed at me. "Another errand?" I asked, keeping my tone casual as I leaned against the doorframe. She adjusted her earring in the hallway mirror, not meeting my eyes. "Just a quick thing. I'll be back in an hour." "Where are you going?" Her hand stilled for a fraction of a second before she resumed fixing her hair. "Just to the pharmacy. We're out of Tylenol." It sounded plausible enough, but something about the way she said it, too fast, too rehearsed, made my stomach tighten. "I can go," I offered, stepping toward her. "No!" Her response was immediate, almost panicked. She caught herself, smiling apologetically. "I mean, no need to bother. I'm already dressed. Besides, I know exactly where it is." Before I could say more, she kissed my cheek and slipped out the door, her heels clicking briskly on the pavement. I sat down on the couch, staring at the muted television screen. The pharmacy was just a few blocks away. 10 minutes, maybe 15, round trip. But an hour later, she still wasn't home. When I heard the car pull into the driveway, I stayed in my seat, pretending to watch TV. Sophia walked in, her cheeks flushed, her lipstick slightly smudged. "You get the Tylenol?" I asked, not looking at her. She froze for a moment, then quickly recovered, holding up a small plastic bag. "Got it!" I nodded, watching her disappear into the kitchen. Something didn't add up. Later that night, I found the receipt on the counter. The timestamp showed she'd purchased the pills 20 minutes ago. Where had she been for the other 40? I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I stayed awake long after Sophia had gone to bed, my mind replaying every detail. The smudged lipstick, the flushed cheeks, the oddly timed pharmacy receipt. The pieces didn't fit. The next day, while Sophia was in the shower, I opened her phone. She wasn't one to lock it, and I told myself I wasn't snooping. I just needed to put my mind at ease. Her messages were normal. Family group chats, reminders from work, nothing unusual. But then I noticed the call log. There it was, a number saved as Dr. Harper. I stared at it for a long time, the name almost mocking me. She called him twice yesterday and once the day before, after office hours. Why would she need to speak with him so often? The moment I saw the number, a thought took root in my mind, one I didn't want to acknowledge. I saved it to my own phone, a quiet, desperate step toward figuring out what was happening. The following week, I drove Sophia to another appointment. She seemed distracted, her fingers tapping against her phone screen, her lips pulled into a faint, faraway smile. As she walked into the office, I told her I'd wait in the car. But the moment the door closed behind her, I made my move. The office building was small, the parking lot quiet. I left the car and circled the building until I found a window slightly ajar. It was high enough to go unnoticed from the inside, but gave me a sliver of a view into Dr. Harper's consultation room. At first, everything looked normal. He was seated at his desk, scribbling notes. But then Sophia entered. Her body language shifted immediately, her demeanor softening as she closed the door behind her. Dr. Harper looked up, and his face lit up in a way that made my stomach drop. Sophia sat down, not on the patient chair, but on the edge of his desk. She leaned in close, her voice low and conspiratorial. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their laughter spilled through the cracked window, light and familiar. And then it happened. Dr. Harper stood, moving toward her. Sophia tilted her head up to meet him, and I saw his hand graze her arm. Light, fleeting, but intimate. She didn't pull away. Instead, she reached up, touching his face with a tenderness that ripped through me. I stumbled back from the window, the world spinning around me. The truth I'd been avoiding was suddenly undeniable. I sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The image of Sophia and Dr. Harper burned into my mind like a cruel photograph I couldn't unsee. Her hand on his face, his gaze filled with something I hadn't seen in years when he looked at her. I wanted to storm in, to demand answers. But what would that accomplish? Sophia would deny it. She'd twist it into something innocent, and I'd have no proof except what I'd seen through a sliver of glass. When she finally returned to the car, her hair slightly windblown, her cheeks flushed, I forced a smile. "How was it?" She hesitated for just a second before answering. "Oh, the usual checkup. Nothing major." I nodded, the bile rising in my throat. "Good to hear." She turned to look out the window and I caught her reflection in the glass. There it was again, that faint, faraway smile. The following days were unbearable. I avoided Sophia as much as possible, making excuses to leave the house early and return late. I threw myself into work, but every quiet moment was consumed by memories of that afternoon at the doctor's office. And yet, I couldn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I began to watch her, not in an overt, obvious way, but subtly, quietly. I noticed how often her phone seemed to buzz, how she'd slip into the next room to answer it, how she'd linger in the shower just a little too long, humming a tune I didn't recognize. One evening, I finally mustered the courage to call the number I'd saved in my phone, Dr. Harper's number. He answered on the second ring. "Hello, this is Dr. Harper." For a moment, I froze. His voice was calm, professional, completely at odds with the image I had of him in my mind. "Hi," I said, forcing my voice to sound steady. "I was wondering if I could schedule an appointment for my wife, Sophia." There was a pause, just a fraction too long. "Of course. When would be convenient?" "Whenever she usually comes in," I replied. "I wouldn't want to disrupt her routine." Another pause. "I'd need to check her file for that. Let me get back to you." He hung up quickly, his tone clipped. My heart hammered in my chest. He knew. The next morning, Sophia was unusually cheerful. She kissed my cheek before leaving for work, humming that same unfamiliar tune. I waited until she was gone, then called Dr. Harper's office again. This time, his receptionist answered. "I'm calling about my wife, Sophia," I said smoothly. "I need to confirm her next appointment." The receptionist hesitated. "Let me check." I held my breath. "She doesn't have any upcoming appointments scheduled." My stomach churned. "Are you sure? She's been in and out recently." "No, nothing in the system," the receptionist replied. "Would you like to book one for her?" "No, that's fine," I said, hanging up quickly. Sophia had lied. That evening, I couldn't hold back any longer. As we sat at the dinner table, the words spilled out before I could stop them. "How's Dr. Harper?" Sophia froze, her fork hovering midair. "What?" I said, "How's Dr. Harper? You've been seeing him so often lately. I just wondered how he's doing." Her eyes darted to mine, wide and startled. "He's fine, I guess. Why are you asking?" I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "No reason, just curious." Her hand trembled slightly as she set down her fork. "You've been acting strange lately. Is everything okay?" The nerve of her, asking if I was okay while she... "I'm fine," I said, my voice tight. "Just tired." Sophia didn't press further, but the tension between us hung heavy in the air. I needed proof, something undeniable. The next time Sophia said she had an appointment, I didn't wait in the car. I followed her. This time, I didn't need to peer through windows or rely on assumptions. I saw them together in the small alley behind the office. Dr. Harper's hands were on her waist, pulling her close. Her arms looped around his neck, their heads pressed together in a way that left no doubt. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. My knees felt weak, and I stumbled back against the wall. I wanted to scream, to charge at them, to demand answers, but I couldn't move. Sophia pulled away slightly, laughing at something he said, her face alight with a happiness I hadn't seen in years. And in that moment, I realized she hadn't looked at me like that in a long, long time. I didn't know how long I stood there, rooted to the spot. The image of them seared into my mind. When I finally moved, it was like I was outside my own body, watching myself walk back to the car, sit behind the wheel, and grip the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I sat in the dark in the living room, nursing a drink, waiting for her to come home. My mind was a storm of anger, hurt, and the bitter taste of humiliation. When the front door finally opened and Sophia walked in, She looked startled to see me. "You're still up?" she asked, her voice light. Too light. "Yeah," I said, swirling the whiskey in my glass. "Couldn't sleep." She hesitated, her eyes scanning my face. "Everything okay?" "No," I said bluntly, setting the glass down with a deliberate thud. "It's not." Sophia froze, her keys still in her hand. "What do you mean?" I stood, my eyes locking onto hers. "I saw you, Sophia, with him." Her face went pale. The keys slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the floor. She started, but no words followed. I took a step closer, my voice low and raw. "You could have told me if you weren't happy. You could have talked to me, screamed at me, anything but this." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't let it sway me. "How long?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How long have you been meeting him?" She didn't answer at first, and that silence was louder than any confession. Finally, she whispered, "A few months." "A few months," I repeated, the words heavy in my mouth, "while I sat in the car, waiting for you, while I trusted you." "It wasn't like that," she said quickly, stepping forward, her voice pleading. It just happened. I didn't mean for it to go this far." "That's the thing, Sophia," I said bitterly. "It went that far because you let it." Her tears spilled over, streaking her cheeks, but I didn't move to comfort her. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said, her voice breaking. "Then why did you?" I shot back, the pain in my chest making it hard to breathe. She opened her mouth, then closed it, as though no excuse would suffice. And it wouldn't. The following days were a blur. Sophia moved out to stay with her sister. To think, as she put it. But I knew the truth. She wasn't thinking about us. She was thinking about him. I wrestled with the betrayal, with the anger and sadness that consumed me. Friends and family noticed the tension, but I brushed off their concerns with vague excuses. How could I explain that the life I'd built, the trust I'd given, had been shattered? One evening, I found myself sitting in the kitchen, staring at my wedding band. It felt like a weight, a reminder of everything we'd lost, or perhaps never truly had. My phone buzzed on the table, and for a moment, I thought it might be her. It wasn't. It was a message from a close friend, someone who'd known both me and Sophia for years. It read, "Whatever happens, don't forget to take care of yourself. You deserve that much." Simple words, but they felt like a lifeline. Sophia returned a week later, her expression guarded but hopeful. She sat across from me at the dining table, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. "I ended it with him," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, but the tightness in my chest didn't loosen. "And what does that change?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know, but I want to try. I want us to try." I leaned back, studying her face, the face I'd loved, the face that had betrayed me. "Why, Sophia? Because you feel guilty? Or because you realized you don't actually want him?" Her silence spoke volumes. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said, my voice steady but cold. "I don't know if I want to." Tears streamed down her face and she reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "I'll stay with my sister a little longer," she said, her voice trembling. "But if you ever decide, if there's ever a chance..." Her words trailed off and she stood, giving me one last, tearful glance before leaving. Months passed, and the pain dulled but didn't disappear. I found solace in small routines, in the quiet support of friends who didn't press for details. Sophia reached out a few times, brief messages, tentative attempts to reconnect, but I didn't respond. It wasn't until a year later, on an ordinary day, that I realized I hadn't thought about that moment outside the doctor's office in weeks. The anger had faded, replaced by something softer, something that felt like acceptance. I still didn't know if I could forgive her, but I knew one thing. I deserved to be whole, whether that was with her, without her, or with someone else entirely. Some betrayals leave scars that never fully heal, but sometimes those scars are what remind us that we survived, and I was ready to move forward on my own terms.